Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a brand new and exclusive story from my good friend RICO, and I just know you guys are going to sink your teeth into this one. Of course, as ever though, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help both the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag Teamfear and DMT's Cryptid Crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled The Bloodlands. Let's get straight into that. Epilogue. They're oft a fine line between revenge and redemption. Part 1. The Beginning. In Northumbria lay the small Norman village. King Philip to the north had granted his Viking raiders this land after they fought him to defend his kingdom. These Vikings were no longer conquerors, nor did they seek to plunder. They were farmers or raised livestock. It had been about 10 years since the plague had passed and wiped out almost 1/3 of the populace. Mass grave sites and burn pits were still visible. And to the west lay the sparse red barren land without vegetation. The locals called it the Bloodlands because of the red or copper tint of the ground. Nothing but scrubs or weeds grew there, and nobody could figure out why this strange Romanian man chose to settle there. A dozen or so covered carts and wagons rolled in mostly at night. They contracted locals to help build a very simple, large, 2-story home, and with 10-foot-high timber walls around it that extended out about 100 feet from the house. The construction was done quickly, and the locals didn't complain because they were paid with gold. A few locals had met a couple of servants who contracted the work. Nobody had met the owner, and all they knew is that his name was Vostok. Shortly after the construction was completed, more wagons would occasionally be seen rolling up the long winding hill under the cover of darkness. During the day, the locals would occasionally notice that some small stone structures started popping up on the barren hillside outside the gate. There was an ominous look about this place, and the villagers tried to stay away. Children were told to never go there, as livestock along with people both young and old would occasionally go missing from surrounding farms or villages. Father David of the chapel near the castle gates feared the worst and believed this place to be of the devil. There were 2 homes that lay on the outskirts of the Norman village, uncomfortably near the Bloodlands. One was the home of Helga, whose husband had died of the plague several years earlier. Her husband raised horses for the king's soldiers, and Helga was a saddle maker. She was a tall, proud, statuesque Viking woman, whose mother had been a shield maiden. She now struggled to make ends meet with teenage daughter Lizzie. The king had become greedy and paid less for his horses and saddles while demanding more quality. Young Lizzie, now 15, was quite a beauty, tall like her mother and with long red hair and emerald green eyes. Nearby lived Olaf with his wife Ingrid and children Bjorn, Eric and toddler Gretchen. Olaf was a renowned Viking warrior and horseman. He tended his livestock and helped the struggling Helga to maintain a few horses that were left for small cuts of profits from sales of the king's men. King Dorian's greed had also made it more difficult for Olaf to sell his blacksmith goods to the king for a profit. Dorian was a handsome man who took power at age 30 after his wise father, King Marcus, had died from the plague several years earlier. Dorian was vain and more preoccupied with his own wealth than the plight of his people. His marriage to King Patrick's daughter was arranged, and Queen Olivia now seldom stayed in a place due to King Dorian having a fetish for young girls. When the Queen discovered the truth about him having numerous young ladies in waiting, most still teenagers, she left to stay with her father, King Philip, to the north. Young Bjorn was a tall and muscular 17-year-old with Scandinavian features. He was blonde with blue eyes, but his eyes were mostly focused on Lizzie when his father wasn't teaching him the blacksmith trade or swordsmanship. The two had grown up together, and there seemed to be a blooming childhood romance building between them. Many were sure that they would grow up and one day marry, but even though Lizzie really liked Bjorn, she had eyes for the city life. She would swoon at the king's knights who came to choose their horses. On occasion, her mother would take her to the city to purchase supplies. Lizzie's eyes were always fixed on the palace, and she would tell her mum that someday she would live there and be a princess. It was on one of these trips that King Dorian spied the young lass from his balcony. He was instantly filled with lust and had his chief servant go find out who this young girl was. After a brief conversation, the servant could tell that young Lizzie was a perfect candidate to groom as the king's next young concubine. The servant reported back to the king and devised a plan. The next time that there would be a purchase of horses, he would personally travel to Helga's and offer a premium price. He would then extend opportunity for an internship for Lizzie to work in the palace and receive an education fit for a princess. And 2 months later, the servant and 2 of the king's men came to inspect the horses and saddles for purchase. He offered 4 times the usual amount upon delivery. Helga was shocked and asked why. He responded that the king felt bad about her circumstance and to honour her husband and her hard work, and to please accept this generous payment. He also said that the king would like to extend a special offer to Lizzie to come live an apprentice in the palace and receive a proper education. Lizzie became ecstatic and her face lit up as she began to say, "Oh, mother, please, please, this is my dream." And over Helga's objections, she finally agreed. In about a month after the full harvest, she would take young Lizzie to live in the castle. Part 2. The Farewell. When young Bjorn learned that Lizzie would be going away to the castle, he was devastated. He didn't want to eat and had a hard time concentrating. At dinner, Father Olaf explained, "Son, this Jenta has material eyes. She would never make a good partner." Mother Ingrid put a hand on his face and said, "My son, she dreams of things that we cannot provide. I know you are heartbroken, but there are many fine girls who have eyes for my handsome young man. You just don't notice because you are so enamored with her." Bjorn hung his head. "Besides," said Olaf, "we have more things to be concerned about. There are reports of animals and even people missing." "What could it be?" said Ingrid. Young Eric blurted out, "Skraelings or possibly even drogs. That is what the old Volva says." And Olaf snapped, "Nonsense, don't listen to that old fool. He claims it is he who put a curse on the Bloodlands." And Ingrid said, "Mind your tongue, Eric, you're frightening Gretchen." But Bjorn stayed silent because he knew that he had seen something he could not explain moving through the trees while coming back from feeding the cattle one evening. "Let's change the subject," said Ingrid. "The harvest will be over this week and we must plan a going-away party for Lizzie." "Oh, I'm not going," said Bjorn. Olaf leaned over and said, "Son, part of being a man is showing respect when you don't like the circumstances." Bjorn held his head down and remained silent for the rest of the evening. And the party for Lizzie started at noon with a few families in attendance. Her mum presented a leather doll that she had made her before her father died. She cleaned it up and put a new handmade dress and ribbons in its hair. "Darling, take this as a reminder of your childhood." But Lizzie scowled and said, "Mother, it's a cheap doll. It will be an embarrassment for me in the palace." And you could see the sadness in Helga's eyes as she fought back her tears. But Lizzie immediately began chatting with her female friends and ignored her mum. Ingrid put her arms around Helga and said, "She is but a child and will one day covet this doll when she matures." And Helga nodded and returned the hug. It was now late afternoon when a horse-drawn coach accompanied by 4 of the king's men on horseback approached in the distance. Lizzie filled with excitement as she saw it slowly drawing near. She had hardly spoke a word to Bjorn the whole time. And as the coach drew up in front of the simple house, the king's servant and a handmaiden exited. They presented Lizzie with a fancy dress that she hurriedly went and changed into. She truly looked like a princess in this frilly green gown that almost matched her eyes. She hugged her mum for the last time and looked over to Bjorn. And she paused for a moment as if something tugged at her heart. She ran to him and threw her arms around his broad chest and said how she would always care for him and never forget the times they spent together growing up. She kissed his cheek, and Bjorn said, "Do you remember how, when I was little and couldn't talk plain, and you didn't like it when I called you Wizzy? For a moment, a tear formed in her eye, and she hugged him as if she would never see him again. Then she walked towards the coach. She put one foot on the coach, and then paused. She turned and looked at Bjorn and said, "You know, I bet one day you will be a prince." Then she entered the coach, and the door closed. Now her mother walked alongside for several steps, holding the door, but Lizzie was totally absorbed in the conversation with the handmaiden. And as the coach disappeared, Helga wept as Ingrid and the other women encircled her. Olaf and Ingrid had promised to help Helga as much as possible. Young Bjorn even promised to deliver the horses to the castle that the king had already paid for. These horses would be of age in the coming spring, and of course he secretly agreed to this in hopes of getting a glimpse of Lizzie. It was now late fall, and it appeared a cold winter was coming early. There continued to be sporadic reports of livestock taken, and occasionally mutilated carcasses were found. As the snow fell and the days shortened, it seemed that the nights were darker and longer than ever before. On occasions, unknown screeching sounds that were never before heard would now resonate through the hills. This sound chilled the Vikings more so than the cold winter nights. Late one bitter cold snow-blown night, in late February, a loud knock came on Olaf's door, waking he and Ingrid and Bjorn. It was Harold, one of Olaf's oldest friends, accompanied by 5 other men with torches and primitive lanterns. "What brings you here in this freezing midnight hour?" said Olaf. "The Knudsen's 2-year-old son has been taken from his crib. The mother said 2 slight creatures burst through the window grabbing him, and then scurried away, barely making a sound. All that was heard was the child's screams for a few seconds, and then complete silence. Now the father and the small group are following tracks that lead into the Bloodlands, but we must hurry before the blowing snows covers all sign." Young Bjorn was up getting dressed, but his father insisted he stay home and protect the family, for little Gretchen might be at risk. "I'll go with him, son. Ready your bow and your sword." Bjorn understood and reluctantly agreed. The tracks disappeared before reaching the Bloodlands, and no sign of the child was ever found. Part 3. The Heartbreak. Let's get straight into that. Now the seasons had changed, and it was now early April, and time for Bjorn to deliver the horses to the king's guard. He had looked forward to this trip for a while and would wear his best clothes in hopes of impressing Lizzie should he see her. He was charged with delivering 3 horses, but could not leave until late afternoon due to his chores. And so this would be an overnight trip, and because his mother didn't want him travelling at night, he would stay with Father David at the chapel. He hugged his mum and little Gretchen, and left as the sun slowly crept down upon the trees. His 4-hour journey would put him there after dark by the time he reached the chapel, which was on the outskirts of town by the main road. An ominous blood-red moon rose that put a bit of a chill into Bjorn's spine, but the warm sight of so many candles burning at the chapel windows, it was a welcome sight as it came into view. As Bjorn dismounted and tied up the horses at the gate, he was met by the welcome sight of Father David approaching with open arms and a big hug. He called for the young intern to stable the horses and led Bjorn inside for a meal. "You have grown so much larger and stronger since the last harvest, when I saw you. How is your family?" "They are well, Father, but can you tell me if you've heard anything about Lizzie?" And the father hung his head for a moment, not knowing how to properly explain the situation without breaking young Bjorn's spirits. "Well, I haven't specifically heard anything about Lizzie, but I did see her one time and she looked well. But you must know that there are rumors about King Dorian and his desire for the company of young girls." Bjorn looked puzzled for a moment, and then the gravity of what Father David said sunk in. He was enraged and stood up as if he would rush out the door towards the castle. Father David calmed him down and convinced him that he will inquire about Lizzie tomorrow. "You must rest so we can get up early to deliver the horses. In the meantime, let us pray about the darkness that has descended upon the Bloodlands and the surrounding area. Father, are the rumors about the Skrelians and Draugs true? Bjorn, there are some things that are hard to comprehend about the evil that has descended upon the Bloodlands. Did you know that it was once a plush green landscape, with a church sitting on a hill that I helped build when I was about your age?" Bjorn looked surprised and said that his father had told him about the Volva, and that it had put a curse on our land many years ago. The father hesitated for a moment and then replied, Even that old witch cannot claim responsibility for what was happening there. Come on, it's bedtime and there is much more for us to discuss tomorrow." Bjorn's mind raced and he barely slept for worrying about Lizzie. And what sleep he did get was restless and full of strange dreams about a man with a hooded cloak holding an unusual sword. Many miles away on the far side of the Bloodlands sat an old run-down farmhouse. The cries and sobs of a young girl emanated from within. It was Lizzie, and she was in great pain as she lay in her old bed, bent over at the waist and clutching her stomach. On her second week at the castle, King Dorian was overcome by his lust for her and began raping her nightly. And she had gotten pregnant, and just as many other girls before her, he had put her away in this old farmhouse and with this evil old woman.
"Hush your cries, lass. You're one of the lucky ones,"
said the old witch, Lucinda.
"You are about to have a miscarriage and you can go back home after it's over."
Lizzie screamed out in rage of pain and sadness. "This wasn't supposed to be happening to me. That bastard has ruined my life." Lucinda responded,
"Yes, lass, you and many more."
"Why do you do this for him?" screamed Lizzie.
"Well, lassie, everybody has to make a living," she replied with an evil smile.
And Lizzie began praying, but not to God. She began praying to anyone or anything that would listen. "Please, I will do anything for anybody if you give me a chance for revenge." And she repeated this many times as Lucinda chuckled, saying,
"Don't waste your breath, lassie. Nobody is listening."
But Lizzie's cries and pleas grew stronger and more impassioned as her pain and desperation intensified. She thought of her mother, she thought of Bjorn, she thought of how her dreams were crushed. But most of all, she thought about how she would do anything for a chance to butcher King Dorian. And suddenly, a cold wind hit the old farmhouse, causing the timbers to creak, and the window shutters flew open. The front door opened, and an ominous voice said, "Lucinda, who do you have here?"
"Another one of the king's young whores," she replied.
"No, I believe this one is different. I believe this one will serve me." Lizzie was suddenly stricken with fear as a shadow filled the doorway to her room. It was a tall, pale man with jet black hair and a sinister look on his face. "Who are you?" said Lizzie as she strained to look at him in the dim light. "I am Count Vostok, and I hear you will do anything for revenge upon the king." "Yes," she screamed in desperation as the pain increased. "I'll do anything you want." "Then drink this," he said as he presented a bottle with a dark tonic. She drank, and in minutes she fell into a deep sleep. He then put his hand on her stomach and summoned Lucinda. And she responded,
"What shall I do with the remains of the bastard child?"
Vostok smiled. "Some of my horde is waiting outside. Throw it to them and we can watch them fight over it." He looked up at Lucinda, and his dark, sunken eyes were now red. Part 4. The Carnage. Father David and Bjorn rose early for the short trip to the king's stables. Upon arrival, Father David told Bjorn to conduct his business and collect payment while he went inside the castle gates. "Meet me there later. I know somebody I can ask about Lizzie." Bjorn nodded, and the father set out for the castle. In about an hour, Bjorn joined him near the gates. I'm sorry, Bjorn, but nobody seems to know anything, and the last person to see Lizzie says it was over a week ago." Bjorn shook his head at the sound of men shouting, and several horses approached. It was 3 men from the Norman village who Bjorn knew. They were frantic and looking for Father David. As the crowd gathered, one man spotted the father and fell weeping at his feet. "Oh my God," he said. "'Tis a slaughter." His arm panted and tried to talk. It was then that Bjorn's eyes met Harold's standing back in the crowd. He instantly felt panic as he ran to Harold. Harold embraced him as Bjorn demanded to know what had happened. Father David drew near with Arn and looked at Bjorn with tears in his eyes. Bjorn screamed, "Somebody tell me what is going on!" Father David took his hand as the crowd now gathered around. "Bjorn, something terrible has happened at your house and Helga's. They are gone. They are all gone." "No!" shouted Bjorn, and he ran for his horse. Harold quickly followed and mounted his horse along with the remaining men to accompany Bjorn. Arn would stay to explain what had happened to the king's guard. By the time Harold and Magnus caught up to Bjorn, they were halfway to his house. They slowed him down a bit and convinced him not to run the horse into the ground. They arrived at a farm as the sun shone directly overhead. The scene outside was bad, with chickens and goats slaughtered, but this scene could not match what awaited Bjorn on the inside. Harold tried to hold the burly young man back, but he was like a charging bull as he entered the house. The door was off its hinges, and things were strewn about as if there had been a war here. His mother lay by the fireplace, covered in blood, with huge gashes in her neck and chest. Next to her, on the floor, lay the beheaded corpse of a disfigured man. Eric's bed was full of blood, but he and Gretchen, well, they were nowhere to be found, and neither was Olaf. "Where is my father?" screamed Bjorn. "Come with me," said Harold, as he led Bjorn up a trail towards a hillside. Olaf's body lay next to a strange, decapitated, pale, wrinkled man, still gripping his sword. Olaf also bore the same wounds as his mother and was covered in dried blood. The young Bjorn sunk to his knees and wept. And more people from the Norman village were now arriving to comfort Bjorn and help clean up the mess. A search party had tried to track the assailants, but all signs abruptly ended deep in the forest. In the distance was the sound of several of the king's guard, followed by Father David in a horse-drawn wagon with the town physician, Dr. Leo. Bjorn was now crumpled on the stoop in front of his house. As Father David rushed to comfort him, Bjorn looked up with tears flowing and asked, "What are those things that my father killed?" Dr. Leo and two of the king's guard were led to the location of the bodies by Harold. "We will find out," said the father. "For now you must come stay with me. I cannot leave the farm. My father, he would want me to take care of." Magnus knelt down. "Bjorn, everything is gone, except for some cows and your father's horse. We will take care of them. Please, go stay with Father David." Father David responded, "Is someone taking care of Helga's remaining horses?" "Yes," said Magnus. "Well said, Father. I must go there and pray, but first I must bless this place with holy water and prayer. We must bury the dead." Dr. Leo approached and said, "Yes, we must burn those abominations." Now the villagers gathered to lay Ingrid and Olaf to rest on the hill overlooking the farm. Father David said, "Bjorn, get your belongings. It is very important that you come with me." It was now late evening as Bjorn tied his horse to the back of Father David's wagon and lay down on the hay. The king's guard accompanied him back to the chapel. "Dr. Leo," Bjorn asked, "have you ever seen anything like those creatures?" And the doctor hesitated and responded, "Well, they resemble the bodies of those who died from the plague, but I don't understand how they were able to do what they did." Bjorn began to sob as he recalled hugging little Gretchen. Father David replied, "It may not make you feel any better right now, but I can assure you your family is in Abraham's bosom as we speak." "That may be true, Father, but whatever, or whoever did this, they must pay." Now a look fell upon Bjorn's face that made him appear to be much older than his youthful 17 years, and his persona completely changed. while Father David and 2 of the King's Guard stopped to bless Helga's home and perform the burial. Bjorn picked up Lizzie's doll and clutched it. It was nightfall as the wagon pulled up to the castle gate for Dr. Leo to get out. He wished Bjorn well and promised to check in on him. Bjorn was completely silent during the short trip back to the chapel. Young intern Thomas put away the horses and wagon as Father David and Bjorn made their way inside. They sat down for a meal and Bjorn barely ate. Father David spoke.
Bjorn, there is much I have to tell you, and it won't be easy. You were adopted after being found in an old church that once sat on the Bloodlands. Bjorn's eyes flew open. You have a birthmark, do you not? On your left chest, over your heart. Is it a crude star with a cross inside it? Yes. How did you know? Because it is I who found you, and took you to Olaf and Ingrid. The old evil Volva made a deal with the devil to curse that land to prevent the missionaries from finding a church there. An unusual winter lightning storm destroyed the church. I was there hiding in fear until I heard a baby crying. This baby was lying on the altar with an unusual cloak wrapped around it, and with a black sword and dagger next to it. That baby was you, and the cloak was made of a strange material, and it has 2 slits in the back. What is its purpose? Said Bjorn. I do not know, but it protected you from the fire. Bjorn puzzled over this as the father said, Watch. Father David presented the cloak and held a torch to it, and it would not catch fire. We have even tried to pierce it with a bow and arrow to no avail. Bjorn, you must tell no one about this cloak. The king will confiscate it immediately. This is too much for me. Olaf and Ingrid are my parents. Yes, they are. Mom Sully, their firstborn son, died in childbirth. They instantly fell in love with you and raised you as their own. But have you ever wondered why you were stronger and bigger, and with better eyesight, better hearing? Your father said that when you were hunting, you could sense the animals, or even people, before anybody saw or heard them. I don't understand. This is too much. Part 5. The Manor. Lizzie woke up in a dark room laying upon musty-smelling quilts of a creaky bed. The pain in her abdomen was now gone, but her head throbbed. There were black curtains over the window, and the light was dim. Although it felt like morning, there was a feel of perpetual darkness to this place. But her eyes could see well, and she could hear distant muffled voices as if they were next to her. She shot up in bed as a knock came on the door, and a voice from outside said, Madame Elizabeth, the master requests you at the breakfast table. Elizabeth was her given name, but nobody had called her by that name since her grandmother. She wasn't weak from her ordeal, and felt energized in a way that she never had. When she emerged from the bedroom to the dim lights in the hallway, she realized that she was upstairs in that old house. She could see that she was dressed in knee-high black leather boots and blood-red silk pants. She also had a fine long-sleeved white silk blouse and with ruffles in the sleeves. She made her way down the steps, feeling graceful like a ballerina. She felt as if she had almost floated. The smell of cooked food filled the air. A small, pale-skinned man met her and said, This way, Madam Elizabeth, and led her into a large dining room and seated her at the end of a long table. He then went to the other end and slid out a chair as a tall, dark-haired man from the old witch's house entered and took his seat. He looked at the servant and said, That is all. Leave us. Madame Elizabeth, I am Count Vostok, and you are at the Bloodlands Manor. Unlike your stay with King Dorian, you are free to go, and you are free to stay. But if you will have your revenge, you must stay and serve me. Well, Elizabeth responded, But I need to see my mother. I don't understand how I can serve you. My dear, I am sorry to inform you that your mother is dead. She went to the castle, demanded to see you, and met an ill fate. The king sent his men to take the rest of her horses. Lizzie was enraged, and her hatred for the king grew stronger. Vostok sat about 10 feet away, and a small smile formed at one corner of his mouth. "Dear Elizabeth, you must be famished. Please eat." In front of her was apparently wine and meat cooked rare, but she ate it ravenously. And as she ate, she felt even stronger, and she felt her hate for the king Dorian grow. "What is happening to me?" she asked. Vostok summoned the servant with a mirror and gave it to Lizzie. She stared dumbfounded at her reflection. Her emerald green eyes were now black. Her once red flowing hair was now white, and her brow thickened as sinister wrinkles covered her face. Lizzie stood up and screamed, "What have you done to me?" Vostok replied, "I have granted your wish. You wanted vengeance, and I have provided the means." She sat back down and calmed herself. Vostok leaned forward and said, "Did you not want to be a princess? Now you have the chance to be a queen." "What? A queen of the damned?" she responded. "You don't understand. What you see here is only temporary. When our work is done, you will live in a palace with all the servants and fine things you can ever dream of." "And what must I do?" she responded. "First, you must prove yourself by carrying out a few simple tasks. Once you have completed these tasks, you will become my queen. When we consummate our relationship, you will have more power than you could ever dream of. You can make King Dorian your pet, or you can shred him to pieces. It does not matter to me. He is a weak fool who has allowed himself to disgrace the kingdom his father built." "So, what do you want me to do?" said Lizzie. "Help me feed my horde and spread my kingdom beyond this barren hill. Help me lure some villagers here. Some will be food, some will become subjects. You are much stronger than my horde, and with your looks, you will be like a siren, pulling the stronger men here for me to convert." But I look evil," she responded. "Look at yourself in the mirror again." Although her hair was still white, her beautiful face had returned. She was puzzled, and Vostok said, "Hunger or anger will contort your face. Keep your beauty by quenching your hunger. Please eat more. Soon you will crave more than meat from cattle. You will crave human flesh, and your transformation will be complete." Lizzie ate and drank her fill, not knowing that the wine contained a human blood concoction. Now full, Lizzie asked, "Who are you really, and how did all this happen?" "I am Count Vostok, and I was a physician and alchemist to the Romanian throne. When the plague struck, the king's family started dying, and he told me that he would reward me with anything my heart desired if I could find a cure. I began to experiment with cadavers who had died from the plague, and then I contracted the disease, and I knew that I was going to die, so I began experimenting upon myself. But nothing worked, and I became weak and desperate. One night a knock came on my laboratory door, and it was an impeccably dressed man who said he could help me find the cure. But there was a condition, that I must work for him, and I could have my own kingdom. I agreed, and he gave me a vial of liquid to mix with infected blood. What I found was a serum that transformed me into a god. And as I grew stronger, I kept my word to the king. I injected his young son with the serum, but it was too much. The child became a monster, trying to attack everybody, even his mother and father. The king had to kill his own son, and then turned his rage upon me. I killed the king and his guards, and then I went into hiding. When I came here, I heard that there was an old wizard who despised the church and wanted to keep the old ways and worship the old gods.
He claimed he knew a blood spell that would curse the land that the first church was built upon. What he lacked was the right blood for the spell. I provided my blood, and he performed his spell and sprinkled my blood around the church. That cold night, an incredible thunderstorm came. The wizard was sure that a lightning was sent from the gods. And then a terrifying bolt of lightning came and destroyed the entire church, except for the altar. I must admit, we ran for our lives. But the very next day, the grass and vegetation began to die, and the area began taking on a copper color. The church was abandoned, and I made a generous offer in gold to buy the land. Several villagers were also glad to build this house for a few pieces of gold. And after that, I slowly began to build my kingdom and usher in my flock. I selectively picked people who lived alone or were homeless. I fed them food with my serum, and over the years they became my subjects and brought me more followers.
Part 6. The Avenger. Let's get straight into that. As Bjorn awoke from another sleepless night, full of strange dreams, Father David knocked on the door. "Come get breakfast, Bjorn. We have much to discuss." At the table, Bjorn handed Father David the money from the sale of the horses. "Here," he said. "I'm sure Miss Helga would want the church to have it." The father nodded and smiled, saying, "You have a good heart, young Bjorn. But today we have some chores that may be difficult." Father David had the wagon ready and brought a bundle containing a cloak, sword, and dagger. "Come, Bjorn. We are going to a secluded place, and on the way I must tell you the rest of your story." Now the wagon left the chapel and turned onto a narrow path a few miles from town. Father David said, "Listen to me, Bjorn. This won't be easy for you. You know how I told you I'd found you and took you to Olaf and Ingrid?" Bjorn nodded, and the father continued. "What I didn't tell you is that I was staying at the church. On that night I heard a chanting sound and peeped out of the window to see the old vulva and the strange man spreading something onto the ground. It was only minutes until I heard what I thought was impossible, an extremely loud crack of thunder in the dead of winter, followed by heavy rain and lightning. For fear of my own life, I curled up in the corner of the cellar and began to recite the Lord's Prayer. A bolt of lightning hit the church and shattered the very foundation. And I heard the sound of things crumbling around me, and suddenly there was silence. Silence, except for the sound of a baby crying. I dug out from under the rubble, and to my amazement, the only thing left standing was the altar. And there, on the altar, was a baby, wrapped in this strange cloak, lying next to the sword and dagger. The closest house was Olaf and Ingrid. It was dark when I knocked on the door and presented my small bundle. Ingrid immediately took the baby from me, and I told them the story. They agreed they would say that they didn't know Ingrid was pregnant and had this baby prematurely. Now the village was so sparsely populated at that time that they probably wouldn't see any people until spring anyway. And so, Bjorn, that is your story. Now Bjorn sat in silence on the wagon as Father David pulled up into the clearing on a hill. "This is as far as we go," said the father, and grabbed the bundle. And they walked for a while until they reached the top of this big hill, and Father David laid the bundle on the ground at Bjorn's feet and backed away. "Young Bjorn, I do not know what will happen, but you must put this cloak on and take this sword in hand." When the father was what he felt a safe distance away, he nodded at Bjorn and said, "Go ahead. It is your destiny now." And Bjorn bent over and slowly unwrapped the cloak, hesitating for a moment. He put it on and took the old black sword in hand, and within seconds his body writhed with pain, and he was thrown to the ground by some unseen force. He came up on one knee, holding the sword's hilt in one hand, and with the point to the ground. The hood from the cloak was now over his head, and with his chin in his chest. The sword started to shimmer, and the letters and etchings on the blade were now clear to see. The material of the cloak seemed to glow as etchings on the fabric also appeared. The cloak seemed to be alive, and suddenly a bolt of lightning struck the ground. A set of wings started to protrude from the slits in the back of the cloak, and Bjorn suddenly stood up. He pulled back the garment over his left breast, and the birthmark was now glowing white. Bjorn's eyes wide and glowed white also. He held the sword over his head and took 2 large steps to the left, where he cleaved the 6-inch tree in half. And Bjorn was no longer the young boy that came to this hilltop. Father David slowly approached. "Bjorn? Bjorn, do you hear me? It's Father David." And Bjorn slowly turned his head and said, Yes, it is you, the one who was ordained to find me." And the father nodded his head and said, "Yes, somehow I know that too. So tell me, Bjorn, what is our next step?" "Father, I am confused, and I feel that I must be alone for a while, here in the forest to find myself, to find my purpose and discover my abilities." "I understand, my son. You know you always have a place to stay with me." Bjorn smiled and said, "I will see you at the appropriate time. There are many things I must learn, many things to discover. I will fast and meditate. It's like many voices are in my head telling me different things." And Father David smiled and said, "Bjorn, your voice has changed. It's much deeper now. Your face has matured and you no longer look like a teenager. I believe you have grown a few inches and put on a few pounds. You must be at least 6.5 feet tall now." And Bjorn nodded and said, "Thank you, Father. Thank you for all you have done. But you must leave me now. This part of the journey is for me to take alone." And Father David nodded and said, "Godspeed, Bjorn. My doors and my arms are always open for you." And Bjorn slowly walked into the forest and disappeared into the foliage. Father David now headed back to the wagon for his return trip to the chapel. Part 7. The Siren. Madame Elizabeth wore a black cloak with a hood over her head to protect her sensitive skin from sunlight. Count Vostok chose not to come out at all during the day because the light was too much for his eyes and skin. Elizabeth mounted a horse and slowly rode about the countryside in search of the weak and vulnerable, or some lonely man who would become amorous at the sight of her. Rumours grew about the tall, beautiful, white-haired woman who rode through the countryside. One by one, men fell into her trap. She would flirt and entice them to a private place, but she would render them unconscious and then take them back to the manor, bound and tied. One night at the dinner table, Count Vostok stood and raised a glass in toast to Madame Elizabeth. She also rose to hear him say the following: "My ranks have swollen, and you have brought many subjects into the fold. But there is only one more thing I need before you become my queen, and you get your vengeance upon King Dorian. I want Father David from the town chapel brought to me." Lizzie felt sick at the prospect of doing this to the man who had baptized her as a child. "But, my lord, why Father David? Why not anybody else? Besides, have I not abducted anybody near the city? What if I'm spotted or captured?" Vostok scowled and said, "My dear Elizabeth, are you having second thoughts about your heartfelt desire to school the man who held you down and raped you, then bound and sodomized you? And please do not forget what he did to your dear mother." Lizzie felt a surge of pure rage run through her veins as her blood pressure rose. She could almost taste the hatred in her mouth as she raised her glass and drank, saying, Yes, I will do this, my lord, and my king." And Vostok smiled and drank again. "Please, my love, sit, eat, and drink, for tomorrow you make your plan to abduct the Father while he sleeps in his very sanctuary.
It was late evening at the chapel when a loud knock came to the door. Father David felt in his heart that he knew who was there. He opened the door to the smiling face of Bjorn. They embraced, and the father led him into the kitchen. It had been almost a month. "Oh, you must be starved."
"Yes, I am," said Bjorn. "On the way here, I thought about this very kitchen."
The father quickly sat out a feast, and Bjorn ate almost everything.
"So, tell me, my son, how are you? Are things clearer now?" "Yes, father. There is an evil in the Bloodlands that must be cleansed."
The father nodded and said,
"I have disturbing news. A strange and sinister but beautiful young woman rides through the countryside on a white horse, enticing young men, and, well, they never return. Young girls are also suspected to have been taken by her. Even the old and sick are missing. The villagers are in fear, and many patrol the area at night to protect their families. Also, King Dorian has fallen ill, and some think that one of his young victims may have poisoned him."
Bjorn nodded.
"Yes, I have heard, and I fear that I know who this strange and beautiful siren is."
And the father was silent as he stared at Bjorn. And Bjorn hung his head and said,
"My heart of hearts tells me that it is Lizzie. My very soul is vexed."
Father David's eyes flew wide in disbelief.
"How can this be? This woman is reported to have white hair and dark eyes. She wears knee-high leather boots and fine riding garments under a black hooded cloak."
Bjorn responded,
"She became pregnant after King Dorian violated her. He put her away to have a child, and, well, something terrible happened. In her anger and pain, she may have made a deal, an agreement with an evil that we do not understand." "What can I do?" said the father. "I know you are friends with the head of the King's Guard. Seek him out and beseech him for help." "Yes, you mean Captain Gerard? He is a good man of honor who understands what a wretch the king has become." "Well, ask if he can be prepared to send troops to the Bloodlands, if necessary. Most of all, see if he can post some guards here at night. I fear that you are in danger." "God will protect me," said the father. And Bjorn grasped his hand and said, "What is it that you used to tell me? God accomplishes his works through those who believe."
Father David smiled and said,
"So, you were listening to at least one sermon." "Tonight, father, I would like to sleep in a bed, but tomorrow I need my horse and a few supplies and a bedroll before I head to the Bloodlands." "Of course, my son," said the father. "And tomorrow morning I will see Captain Gerard."
Early the next morning before dawn, Father David awoke to the sound of Bjorn riding away on his horse. The father made it a point to go see the captain first. They discussed the troubling events, and Captain Gerard agreed that he should post 2 guards at the chapel for a while. He also agreed to prepare a troop of his men to inspect the situation at the Bloodlands. And since the king had fell ill, he hardly took notice or paid attention to events. On the first night at the chapel was uneventful for the guards, but from a distance Madame Elizabeth hid in the shadows, formulating her plan. The following night, Father David made sure to pray for Bjorn and the people in the countryside. He even said a prayer for Lizzie and asked for a miracle to deliver her. It was now bedtime, and the interns blew out all of the candles, and the chapel was almost dark. At the front entrance, 2 guards arrived at their appointed time for their all-night shift. Lizzie tied her horse far away from the chapel, but for her it was just a short run. With her newly found strength, she had thrown many of her men over her shoulder and made away with them. Father David was a small man and would be of no consequence for her. Lizzie now crept closer to the chapel. She decided she would scale the wall, using her hard 1-inch nails to grip the stones in the wall. She climbed silently like a cat until she reached a window in the middle of the chapel's top floor. And the shutters were closed, but her long nails jimmied the latch. She opened the shutter and crept silently down the hall,
using her keen night vision. She quietly opened the door and discovered the two interns sleeping. The next room must be Father David's, but how would she escape with him? She opened the door and there lay this kind man. She was about to do the unthinkable, but she mustn't allow emotion to stop her from her mission. She was now mostly a creature of the night, doing Vostok's bidding. She was about to become a queen and exact her vengeance upon King Dorian. And she crept silently to the bed and rolled up Father David in a blanket and wrapped her rope around him. She gagged his mouth with a cloth and tied it off along with the rope. And all that was heard was Father David's muffled screams as the interns ran out to see this tall woman running down the back steps and with the father over her shoulder. They ran screaming to the front entrance and alerted the guards. One guard ran quickly to tell the night guard at the gate. The other guard ran as fast as he could, but this woman, she ran like a deer, and he could not catch up at all. All he heard was the muffled pleas for help and the sound of the horse riding away. Part 8. The Horde. Let's get straight into that. Bjorn left his horse in the thick trees near the Bloodlands. He would go on foot and figure a way to confront Vostok. And as he stealthily crept among the rocks, he could smell the death and rot in the air. He would occasionally see figures moving in the distance, but wanted to avoid detection as long as possible. In the distance, he could hear the heavy footfalls of a horse approaching rapidly. He hid behind some boulders and tuned his senses to other sounds and smells in the area. He crept, seeing perfectly in the darkness, until the manor came into sight. There were many candles and even torches burning outside. This was unusual because he had reconned this place many times, learning the layout. But tonight, he sensed something different in the air. An approaching horse had now slowed and was coming up the narrow trail that led to the manor. People or creatures were now starting to emerge from the stone structures dotting the hillside. And suddenly he heard the distressed voice of Father David. He was on this horse saying, "Please, Lizzie, this isn't you. Let us stop and pray." A crass voice that did not sound like Lizzie, he knew, responded. "It is too late for that, Father. I must deliver you to the Master." And Father David then cried out, "Please, God, have mercy upon her soul." And as she knocked him unconscious, Bjorn's mind raced as he prayed at the same time, not knowing what to do next. The horse was now slowly ambling up this hill, no more than 100 feet from him. He could rush Lizzie and knock her off the horse and make her run for it on her horse with the father. But dozens of these night creatures would swarm him, and while he fought them, Father David might perish. There was only one thing he could do, and that was to confront Lizzie, or the person he used to know as Lizzie. And as the horse drew within 10 feet, Bjorn stepped out onto the trail with his cloak over his head. Lizzie froze, and for the first time in a while she felt true fear. At that instant, several of the creatures rushed Bjorn from all 3 sides. Bjorn drew his sword, and it shimmered and seemed to reflect upon his cloak. The first 2 creatures to meet him were immediately decapitated at the waist. One from the other side had its neck snapped as it tried to jump onto his shoulder. The others now stopped their advance as they saw what had happened. They gazed at the sword as it shimmered in unearthly colours. Suddenly he felt something hit his back, and sharp teeth tried to penetrate his cloak. He reached around, grabbing a handful of thick white hair, and flung Lizzie to the ground. And there was total silence now. She looked up at him and was astonished over what had just happened. She squinted her eyes, trying to make out his face as he pulled back his hood. "I feel like I know you. Who are you?" And Bjorn responded, "What's the matter, Wizzy? Have you forgotten me?" And her black eyes flew open along with her mouth, exposing her sharp teeth. "Why, how is this possible?" she said. "Oh, but it is. I am here to rescue you and end this evil." And she hung her head and said, "It's too late for me," and tensed her body like she was about to pounce. when Bjorn pulled something from inside his cloak. It was the doll that Lizzie's mother made for her, and Bjorn threw it to the ground in front of her. She saw it and immediately began to weep, clutching the doll. Her eyes started to turn back to the normal colour. Even tints of red were appearing in her hair. Then she shook her head and said, "Bjorn, I must kill King Dorian for raping and killing my mother. That's all that matters."
"Lizzie, it was Vostok's horde that killed your mother and my family on the same night. I saw the carnage. It was not the king's doing. And besides, he's very sick. They believe that one of his young victims may have found a way to poison him."
Her eyes flew open, and a different kind of rage filled her. Father David was now awake and spoke from the back of the horse. "Lizzie, please. You have been bringing innocent people here to help Vostok build an army of bloodthirsty night creatures. It's not too late to stop, and it's not too late for you to right the wrongs you have committed. Search your heart. You know that Bjorn loved you, and through some divine miracle he is here to save you." She hung her head as more of her humanity crept back in. But that moment was cut short by the evil voice of Count Vostok as he shouted at his minions to attack. Captain Gerard and 40 of his best men were now riding like the wind for the Bloodlands. The thundering sounds of their hooves would have been audible to Bjorn, but he was now rushed by dozens of these creatures of all shapes and sizes. Vostok leapt at least 30 feet through the air, landing in front of Lizzie. He backhanded her, knocking her with such force that her feet left the ground, and she came to a rest on a large stone. He loomed over her and said,
"How dare you betray me? I was giving you everything you ever wanted."
She screamed,
"You lied to me! Your monsters killed my mother and Bjorn's family!"
She seethed with a righteous indignation that she had never felt before. She pulled her knees up to her chest and let out a double kick with all her might that sent Vostok 10 feet through the air. Vostok was totally caught by surprise as he shot to his feet. His eyes glowed red with anger as he shouted, "I will gut you like a pig." He pulled a saber from his belt and lunged for Lizzie, but before he could swing down upon her, Bjorn stepped in front with his sword and blocked it. He threw a large dagger to Lizzie and said, "Help me out with these creatures. Vostok is mine." Lizzie leapt from behind Bjorn with his dagger in hand and started dispatching the horde one by one as Bjorn and Vostok squared off. Unknown to any of them, Lizzie's horse had become spooked and ran down the hill with Father David still tied on. And over the sound of him being bounced breathless by the horse, he could hear the sound of many hooves thundering towards him. The horse instinctively ran towards the road leading to town and approaching the king's guard. Part 9. The Sacrifice. Vastly outnumbered by the bloodthirsty creatures, Lizzie fought on, even crushing skulls with rocks, stabbing hearts or slicing necks with Bjorn's dagger. Vostok stared at Bjorn and said, "Child, you are about to lose your life, and I will eat your heart before you take your last breath." Vostok swung his saber, but Bjorn blocked it. However, his long claws scratched the side of Bjorn's face, leaving bloody marks. Vostok jumped over Bjorn's head and headed for Lizzie, but Bjorn swung his sword, putting a deep cut in the back of Vostok's leg. And as he tumbled to the ground, he ordered all of the horde to attack Bjorn. About 2 or 3 miles from the trail to the Bloodlands, the king's guard met Father David and loosed him. Captain Gerard led his men up the trail, ready for battle, and with Father David lagging behind. Dozens of the creatures piled on top of Bjorn as he struggled and fought. It looked like a pile of ants, with one occasionally being ejected from the fray, covered in blood. Vostok now had one hand around Lizzie's neck and the other around the wrist that held the dagger. He picked her up off the ground as she struggled and tightened his grip around her neck. At that instant, a huge sound erupted from behind Vostok as many creatures flew through the air. Bjorn's wings erupted through the slits in the back of his cloak. He stood tall, and an eerie glow emanated from him. Vostok was obviously frightened at the sight, and loosened his grip on Lizzie, allowing her to fall to the ground, gasping for air. Bjorn rose in the air and swooped down on Vostok, swinging his sword. Vostok tried to block it, but Bjorn's sword severed his saber. The horde began to run downhill to meet the King's Guard as they dismounted. Lizzie still had the dagger waiting for an opportunity to skewer Vostok. Bjorn now landed in front of the horrified Vostok. Bjorn raised the sword over his head and cleaved it down through Vostok's left shoulder, stopping at his right hip. He withdrew the blade as Vostok's face had a look of horror. His body separated into two pieces as he fell to the ground. And Lizzie took the dagger and cut out his heart. As the battle raged down the hill, Bjorn fell to his knees, and the wings retracted into his back. Lizzie ran to him, throwing her arms around him. Father David arrived as the King's Guards were dispatching the remaining creatures. The three embraced, and the father offered a prayer of thanks. He then looked at Lizzie and said, "You must expel any evil left inside you," and poured a small vial of holy water upon her. She became weak and fell on her side, and Bjorn placed his hand upon her head. She started violently vomiting the dark liquid. They held her as this went on for several minutes, and she finally began to dry heave, and it was over. Her eyes were slowly beginning to turn green. Her hair was slowly turning red again. Captain Gerard arrived, and Father David said, "You must search the manor and then burn it to the ground." And he turned to Bjorn and insisted that they get Lizzie back to the chapel. And back at the chapel, Lizzie was regaining her strength and preoccupied thinking about what the king had done to her and her mother. "What is it that you really want?" said Bjorn. Lizzie responded, "I still want justice for what happened to me, but I want to be with you also." And Bjorn responded, "I'm not even sure if that's possible now." And she laid her head on his shoulder and cried. In her heart, she still wanted revenge on the king. And Bjorn said, "What if I can get you inside the palace to confront the king?" "How?" she said. After the midnight hour, they walked out behind the chapel. Bjorn knelt, and suddenly his wings began to grow. To Lizzie's astonishment, he wrapped his arms around her, and they took flight. They landed on the castle balcony in front of the king's room, and they quietly entered and crept up to the king's bedside. "Who is there?" said the king. Bjorn immediately put his large hand over his mouth and said, "Be quiet if you want to live." Now the king was frail and frightened, and didn't even resemble the handsome man he once was. His eyes were cloudy, his vision was weak. And Bjorn handed Lizzie his dagger as she bent over him and pulled a large candle close. She looked into his face and said, "Do you remember what you did to me? Do you remember having my mother killed?" Dorian tensed as Lizzie pushed the sharp point of the dagger against his throat until a few drops of blood began to stream down on the bed. And he trembled and said, "Please, don't kill me. Please." "Please," she responded. "The same way I said please and begged you not to brutalize me." "I am sorry. Please forgive me. I'll do whatever you ask." And Lizzie started to push the blade into his throat, but then hesitated. Bjorn said, "There is oft a fine line between revenge and redemption. On which side of this line will you stand?" She withdrew the blade and turned to Bjorn and said, "Please, get me out of here." Bjorn bent over King Dorian and said, "Do something good in what time you have left. The poison in your body is weak compared to the poison in your soul." And with that, they returned to the balcony and flew away. Waking up to the breakfast at the chapel felt almost like home to Lizzie and Bjorn, but Lizzie still had an appetite for meat cooked rare, and Father David's eyes widened as she tore into her food. "What will you two do now?" said the father. "Well," said Lizzie, "I'd like to go home to my mother's house for a while." Bjorn said he would like to return to his house also. "Maybe we can be farmers again," they said. Father David told him that Captain Gerard found a lot of gold at the manor and gave a big share to the church. He would happy to be invested in the two and get their feet again. That evening, Bjorn and Lizzie sat behind the church under the stars. "When will we tell the father that I still have the powers?" said Lizzie.
"I have a feeling he already knows," said Bjorn. "But I think he believes you will use them for good."
She looked up at him and smiled, saying, "Do you believe that?" And he responded,
"I think so. But you must first learn to control your anger, like last night. And maybe we can be a team and fight evil together."
She laid her head upon his shoulder and said, "Really, Bjorn? Can we ever be together? Can you ever forgive me for breaking your heart?"
"Forgive you, yes. Be together, I don't know. There is nothing I want more, but first I need to find out what or who I really am. For now, I am just happy to be right here."
She kissed him and said, "Bjorn, on this day forward my heart belongs to you. And if you want to fight evil, I will be at your side." "Oh, one more question," said Lizzie. "How did you know I wouldn't kill Dorian?"
"I didn't,"
he said, and pulled her close as they kissed under the starry sky. Epilogue. We must search for the light in the darkness. Wow. Suddenly another one. Wow. Absolutely awesome, nail-biting, spellbinding and heartbreaking story there from the incredible mind of our good brother from another mother, RICO, exclusive to the DMTForestOfFEAR channel. A mighty thank you, RICO, for your patience and awesome dedication to this show. I really do appreciate each and every effort you put in and your incredible craft. I hope that you are recovering well from the times of turbulence and your family and friends are well alike. Well, guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Well, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag Teamfear and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Now, if you think you can pen a story packing as much punch as this, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is as on screen. contactthedeadone@gmail.com. And I really look forward to hearing from you. Lots and lots in the pipeline, guys, and thank you ever so much for bearing with. Still lots of ups and downs and roller coaster rides setting up home and trying to find a permanent place to plant roots. But I do really hope you're all well and happy and life is treating you good and you're trying to stay fit and focused. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.